Combating greenwashing with supply chain data. My guest is Bart De Muynck. He is Chief Industry Officer of Project 44. Hello, Bart.
Hello, Bob.
Always good to have you with us. Today we're going to talk about this idea of sustainability, specifically when it comes to so-called Scope 3 emissions, which are those emissions which are kind of committed by your supply chain partners over which you have no control. Very difficult, challenging thing. Where are companies currently right now with regard to being able to measure those emissions?
Yeah, great question, Bob. Now, the fact is that ESG has become a lot more important the last few years. But as you point out very accurately, there's different scopes. And scope 1 and 2 is where companies have had a lot of control. And scope 3, as you rightly pointed out, are those emissions that are kind of outside your own company. So transportation would fall under that scope 3, assets that are part of your control. And that's about 60% of all the supply chain emissions. So there's a lot more focus on scope 3, and even around the world you see different stages of regulations and mandatory reporting around that. But the fact is that a lot of companies haven't started doing the things to actually capture that data and to be able to report on the data. And as we always say, right, you can't manage what you cannot see. But there is more willingness from organizations to look into that and to say what data is really out there that we can capture to start understanding what our Scope 3 sustainability footprint is.
Well, you wonder if there's maybe a little bit more talk than there is actual action. What does greenwashing mean?
Yeah. So greenwashing is kind of putting out there that you're doing a lot more around sustainability than what you're actually doing.
Right.
And obviously, even here at the conference, you hear a lot of talk about sustainability. It's a hot topic. But the reality is that when you put out there that you're sustainable, what are really the facts behind it? What is it that you're doing to justify saying, hey, we are sustainable? And the fact is that there are very little things happening in the sense that very few companies have really started that journey at this point to capture the data and then start not just reporting, but actually taking actions based on that data to improving their Scope 3 emissions and making sure that their CO2 and other emissions, that they can actually effectively lower them.
You say capture the data. Does that imply that the data is already out there? I mean, or is that an issue just getting the data to even exist before you can, quote unquote, capture it?
There's a couple of nuances to that, Bob. So yes, there's a lot of data out there, right? And I think in maybe a previous show I said we almost have too much data now. And yes, even that data we can capture. We can capture that as Project 44 because we link into the assets themselves, or you can work with partners who are actually specialized in the data capture of certain assets. But the fact is that just having data isn't enough. You need to be able to take that data in and then to represent it in a way that people can understand it from a sustainability factor. But what really the issue is that companies are trying to understand now what is available out there. But when it comes to taking action, either they're not quite there yet. They've started with the strategy, but not yet with the tactical execution of the strategy.
Right.
The second part is most companies do not have a budget available to act on it. Meaning, if you come with a solution, you say this is going to cost you X, Y, Z, they have no budget for it. That's unfortunately for most of the companies a reality.
Well, okay. I mean, there has to be this realization that you'd better have a budget soon. But again, this idea of whether the data exists or not, you're depending to a certain extent on those partners, on those Scope 3 partners, reporting and measuring their own emissions before you can even begin to capture that data. So is that not still a challenge, getting all those partners in a complex, multi-tier supply chain to play ball with you on that?
Yeah, you're correct, but there are ways of collecting that, right? So telematics, and again, around the world, there's different stages of an adoption of use of telematics.
Yeah.
But you can pull things from telematics devices like the actual fuel consumption, which give you actual data. So I think part of the problem as well is not just capturing data, because a lot of people are starting to report on data, but it's all based on assumption and averages. That is a lot easier to accomplish, but it's not very accurate. And the difference is, yes, you could use it for reporting, maybe even reporting up to GLEX standards and their methodology, but it's not going to help you if you actually want to improve. Because what we've seen, and we do it based on actual data, that you might have 40% variance when you're doing it based on averages and assumptions.
Okay. All right, so Bart, so what are some of the first steps that companies should take in order to make sustainability specific to the Scope 3 emissions requirements?
Yeah. So you really have to understand that your strategy has to include the Scope 3 emissions, right? Because as I said before, many companies started working on Scope 1 and 2 many, many years ago, and we've actually seen a decrease in those Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So make sure it's a focal point in your strategy. And then really where you start, when you start executing on that, it really starts with capturing the data and reporting on it. Because we need to understand where we are from a sustainability footprint. And then on top of that, get the benchmarks. We're not quite there yet, Bob, but the industry is looking as we capture more information and we have that across a much larger network, then now we can say what is the benchmark or what does good look like. Now from an asset perspective, for example, of a truck, you can say a certain number of emissions for a truck is good and some is bad. And that's the other complexity and the reality that we're seeing with fleets, even in the US, that you're having companies that have older fleets who obviously still have much higher emissions. And then you have younger fleets with much younger vehicles and much more modern, even sometimes clean diesel engines with much lower emissions. But that insight will then allow you to make the decision about what carriers or what assets to use. That's how you start lowering those emissions.
I see. But you, again, just bringing those carriers on board, getting them in a multi-tier supply chain, step one's got to be to make your relationship with them contingent upon them providing you with that data as a starting point. So I assume that that's also a absolute necessity. Right?
There are tools out there, like the Freight Sustainability Index is one of those products that was developed by University of Tennessee.
So that gives you a benchmark of sorts, does it not?
That gives you the insight. That captures over 90% of all the U.S. trucks. So companies can start using that. So it's not like they have to start from scratch and they individually have to connect and pull that information from those carriers.
Where do you think we'll get this benchmark? What direction will it come from? Will it be an NGO? Will it be the private sector? Will it be governments? Who's going to present that?
I certainly hope that government will have a say in that, to say if we at a certain point going to emit or going to start charging carbon taxes, there should be a benchmark. What is good and what isn't good? Just as we have in other things, right? Or where we're saying, hey, you can only have certain outputs of emissions in certain other organizations. We should do that on the transportation side as well. And that will give people an indication of what they should strive for. Now it's a little bit of the wild, wild west. As I said, you might have the data, but where do I set the limit? And that obviously is even different region by region.
Great. Well, those are some great pieces of advice, Bart, for how companies can get past the greenwashing thing into some real real effective moves toward curbing Scope 3 emissions. Thank you very much for that. Can we take a moment, though, just to talk a little bit about Project 44 itself, where you fit into the picture, what you guys are up to right now?
Yeah, very good. So sustainability is one of the products that we're working on as well. I always say that visibility data is really the gateway to sustainability data. So as we discussed before, how do you get that data from the carrier? It's through the connectivity to the carriers. And so the platforms that have that network allow to make that connection. And besides pulling information, for example, where a truck is, you can have that same information around sustainability available because it's just another field that you can pull from that telematics device and feed that then to the shipper, who can use all of that data about all the carriers that they're using to not just make a better decision maybe from a procurement perspective of which clean carriers to select versus maybe the dirtier carriers, but even in their optimization engine, in their transportation management systems, they could use those. I would say you start measuring that per carrier and give them a score. And just as in a TMS, we will look at a rate when we select a carrier for an OD pair, and we maybe look at quality of service. Sustainability should become that additional characteristics that companies should take into mind when they make that decision. That's going to start driving, and that is something that from a reality is much closer by than, for example, thinking, oh, I'm just going to electrify everything, because that's not the solution, right? Even if you would have the funds to go buy these electric trucks, where would you find them?
Yeah. Always an enlightening experience, Bart. Thanks again for sitting down with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
I have been speaking with Bart De Muynck of Project 44. Thank you very much for watching.